Hello, my name is Andrew Bremberg, and I'm the President Emeritus of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. In studio today for a special episode of Profiles in Freedom is a foreign policy expert, a longtime fighter against totalitarianism, and VOC's new President and CEO, Dr. Eric Patterson. Dr. Patterson previously served as president of the Religious Freedom Institute, where he led the organization's efforts to advocate for religious liberty around the world through training and education programs for students, teachers, and public officials, and other audiences. Prior to RFI, Dr. Patterson was a university dean and professor. His government experience includes service as a White House fellow, time at the U.S. State Department, and over 20 years as an Air National Guard commander. He is an active scholar on the moral dimensions of national security and international affairs, as well as an author of over 20 books, including Just American Wars: Ethical Dilemmas in U.S. Military History, and the co-edited volume, The Reagan Manifesto: A Time for Choosing and Its Influence. Eric, thanks for joining the show and welcome to the VOC team. So, who is Eric Patterson?
Andrew, thanks for having me, and I'm delighted to join the team here at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And I think in a lot of ways I'm a concerned citizen. I grew up during the last part of the Cold War, and so we had an imminent threat from not just the Soviet Union as a military power, but from the ideology of Marxism that goes with it. And in parts of the world that hasn't changed today, in places like China and North Korea, they're direct threats to us and our way of life. And so I think a lot about that, just like a lot of other citizens.
As a scholar and student of history who has fought for liberty throughout your career, what are the key aspects of communism that keep you up at night, that cause you concern as a citizen, as you said, and that should cause concern more widely across our nation?
Well, our mission and vision statement at the Victims of Communism talks about the false hope of Marxism, so a false set of ideas that are in the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, that collection. And then second, the totalitarian impulse of the people who try to drive that forward. Those are the two things that really keep me up at night, whether it's at the hands of some sort of Marxist ideologue who wants to impose that on us, or if it's the justifications for the use of force by, say, the Communist Party in China.
So just picking up again on the Chinese Communist Party, of course, this was what drew me to VOC's mission, given my previous experience. But what do you see as the kind of big threats that America should be focusing on vis-a-vis the CCP today?
Yeah, well, many people say to me, well, they're not really all that communist. There's not an ideology there, but there really is a mixture of a Chinese nationalism, a pride in the country, seeing it come into its own, but really with a truly communist ideology that says a small elite can decide for everybody else, and that they should have a hegemonic presence not in their own society, but in others, and that individual liberties and collective liberties, such as freedom of speech, thought, conscience, assembly, especially freedom of religion, ownership of private property outside the control of the state, all of those things Beijing wants to manage. And if you don't believe it, read the speeches of this president, President Xi in China. He lays it all out in classic communist totalitarian terms.
I think that's exactly right. That's so important for people to understand. They have this misconception maybe that, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that, China started to open up. And while there's elements of truth from an economic perspective that they did, under Xi Jinping today, we have seen, I kind of use the term, a true re-communization of their own domestic economic policies of shutting down their economy, exerting more state or party control over all aspects of life.
Can I give you one example
Please,
of this?
please.
So the China Daily is a little propaganda newspaper that if you're here in Washington, it's for free all over the place in the lobby of businesses and things. And I'm one of the few people actually picks it up and reads it. It's pretty interesting. And recently there was an article in this communist propaganda fluff piece about how President Xi's speeches are now the first of 5 volumes have been translated into Swahili and distributed across Africa. And it's easy to laugh at that until you think, no, this is public diplomacy. He's laying out a vision for the world. They're translating it as very serious academic material, and then they're for free putting it in libraries all across Africa. Then they'll create research scholars at universities to study those things. I mean, it's a classic case of ideological indoctrination.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I saw it when I was posted at the UN in Geneva, the attempt by the CCP to take Xi Jinping thought, as you know, it's called, and not only influence it in their own education domestically, but also, as you mentioned, internationally. We saw, your example of translating into Swahili, but we've also seen them trying to incorporate it into, UN documents and documents that countries, sign up to and agree with. I think we could talk about the challenge of the CCP for, a very long time. Let me come back to the beginning. So both of us kind of grew up towards the end of the Cold War. Tell us a little bit about your experience of, coming to grips with what was communism to you growing up. You already mentioned, the Soviet Union, the evil empire, but walk us through that story. How did that, go through?
Yeah, I came of age when Ronald Reagan was president. And my parents were very explicit. I mean, we didn't have a political family in a sense. My father was a small businessman. My mom was a nurse and a stay-at-home mom. But my mom would have the TV news on, the world news, at 5:30 or 6 p.m. while she made dinner every night, and would comment, "Oh, that's a terrible thing going on in Nicaragua. Oh, President Reagan is right. I hope you're hearing." And it was just the natural part of conversation going into dinner. Our family watched when President Reagan gave his speeches, his inaugural addresses and other ones. And of course, it was very inspiring as a teenager and as a high school student during that time. And then, the year I was a senior in high school, the Berlin Wall fell. And so I could tell the change between the sense of kind of hopelessness and the sense of despair at the end of the Carter administration, and the pride in America, our values, and the sense that our values are not just for Americans, that the idea of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, that's a gift to everybody, not imposed, but recognizing their fundamental human dignity. And Reagan was all about that.
So we've mentioned religious freedom a couple times briefly. Of course, your most recent post was as the president of RFI, the Religious Freedom Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience leading that organization and the focus on religious liberty? Because of course, for those of us standing for the victims of communism, religious liberty is a huge component of that from an anti-communist perspective. But what brought you to RFI, and tell us about your leadership there?
Yeah, so I had a wonderful experience about 15 years ago working with a team of scholars at Georgetown University at a new study center called the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And I went on to other things, and a decade later, a group of those scholars, led by a former diplomat, Tom Farr, who had headed the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom, and Kent Hill, who'd been at USAID as acting director for a while, and some others, left and formed an independent nonprofit to really focus on how to understand the religious and cultural dynamics of the world that we live in. So from terrorism to humanitarian aid, and especially the good and the value of religious freedom as the first freedom. And it really is directly applicable to what we do at VOC, because whether it's the CCP or the Soviet government or the North Koreans or whoever, those governments cannot abide religious freedom. And the reason is they can't have an allegiance to something other than the party or the state or the demagogue. And religious freedom naturally says there is a higher power. There is an allegiance that calls even leaders to account. And citizens have a moral code that's above the party or the state. And so it's a direct threat in every context. And that's why religion and religious freedom is the first thing that communists tend to crack down on.
You're exactly right. I mean, and when we've given countless tours here at the VOC Museum or lectures I've given, while every country's experience of communism has been unique over the last century, all of these regimes exhibit very similar characteristics. And the religious oppression that you already just touched on is something we see in every country, whether it was, under the Soviets over 100 years ago, all the way through to today in North Korea and Cuba and, of course, China. You're also a scholar. Tell us a little bit about your scholarship work and your background and the work you've done, and how that relates, because I think it very powerfully relates to our cause of communism.
Yeah. So a big interest for me is the intersection of thinking about ethics and morality with national security policy. So the classic just war tradition It's both a Christian tradition, it's a classical tradition, but it's also the way that we've formalized the laws of armed conflict. So its principles are, for instance, in the United Nations Charter and in the Geneva Conventions and things. And those principles are actually principles about law, politics, and society, about having right government ordered towards the objective of peace. And it's a natural foil to communism, because the communists say, no, might makes right. And we can lie, we can cheat, we can oppress people towards our goal of worldwide revolution. And so often the counter cases for just war thinking are, look at the perfidy, look at the lying, look at the breaking of international laws and covenants of whatever case you want to pick, be it the Soviets, be it the Chinese, be it the Cubans. And that continues to be something that I'm very interested in here in our work at VOC.
And following up on that, I couldn't agree more. When I was at the UN, it was very clear. We always talked to other countries that the U.S. helped build the entire UN system. It was imbued with our Western values. And that what we see today are countries, not just China, but China in particular, that looks to try to reshape the rules in the international order, in these UN system, international organizations, with both their kind of own communist ideology, as we alluded to earlier, the kind of Xi Jinping thought, but really I see it as to weaken the barriers to bad aggressive action that these rules and laws of international law are meant to prevent. And in my dialogue with folks in our own government and in other governments, what was most kind of concerning to me and frustrating is that we don't stand up for them. We say we believe them. We are the ones, the Western world largely, that helped bring them into fruition, into existence, but we don't stand up for them. I mean, from your research and talking about it, how important is it for standing up for that, for those rights practically?
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right. I'm with you that what we govern our own behavior in the United States and in the Western Alliance by these principles, by trying to protect non-combatants, by having a legal chain of command that comes from command authority, by counting the cost of conflict and things. And that entire rule-based, or what is often called the liberal world order, which is a common good for states and for societies, is under attack by, particularly by China, but by other rogue actors as well, ones who want to degrade that. And why do they want to do that? I mean, so Russia is a good example of this in its current manifestation. The Russian leadership causes chaos. They've attacked several of their neighbors in the past. They've sent peacekeeping troops in who do their own thing on the ground. They hire mercenary groups like Wagner. And by the way, that doesn't mean that Wagner in some cases hasn't actually had a role to play in imposing order, but it hasn't been a common good order for the citizens, say in West Africa. It's usually tied to commercial interests that better the oligarchs of the Russian state around Vladimir Putin. So this kind of chaos, where does an ideology of chaos come from? Well, that's the ideology of the Communist Manifesto, of Lenin's writings: cause chaos, whip things into shape, or whip things out of shape, create the opportunities for revolution. And that has not changed very much to this point.
When we fail to respond to acts of aggression or other infringements on this world order, I think you could describe much of, unfortunately, U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis China for the last 20 years as failing to respond to instances where they either don't follow the international norms and rules or break them. Why? What do you think the consequence of that, and why is it so important that whether it's the U.S. government or other governments actually respond to that? And I'll just put it as a caveat: how do you view that from the historical pattern of how we addressed the challenge of the Soviet Union?
So there was some thinking, obviously, in the 90s and the early 2000s that China might follow the model of some places in Latin America, very few, by the way, or places such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, ironically, right? South Korea. In other words, places that as their economy liberalized and that a rising standard of living, education, citizens wanted to be more empowered, and so they had to have a political liberalization as well. In other words, citizens, in essence, took their rightful step and created representative governments in those places. And we had a lot of hope that rising prosperity would do that in China. And so I think that many people were willing to look the other way after Tiananmen Square and hope by, say, 1995, 1999, 2005, that China would be on the trajectory towards transition. Well, that is not the case. But we have not changed course. Not really. We have not. The Obama administration said that we would do a pivot towards Asia. It was very, very slow in coming. The Trump national security strategy addressed these things. We did not make a lot of progress, and we haven't made progress with this administration. So here's a simple rule of thumb. What do they say and what do they do? How do they treat their own people? How do they treat their neighbors? What are the messages they send at home? And what is the ideology or the messages that they send on the international stage? In China, when it comes to human rights, a common good liberal order for everybody, following the rules, they break down on all four of those.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's so true. And, as we know, particularly for them, actions speak louder than words. Their own actions, but also our actions. And when our words are not followed by action, I fear we just invite more, bad behavior. Coming back to much of our kind of general education mission here at VOC, whether it's our fantastic Witness Project videos that I think are so impactful, the curricula work we've done, the teacher training work we've done, you've got a great background in experience and, working the education field directly. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts of the challenges and opportunities from an education perspective of reaching our next generations to teach them about the victims of communism.
Well, I started my career as a public high school teacher at my alma mater and my parents' alma mater, a high school near San Diego, and taught at the community college level up to major universities. And I've been a university dean, so while I've seen the accreditation, everything from grading papers to accreditation. And I mention that to say that, one of the just big challenges is teachers are busy, institutions are busy. And so even if we have a great product, it's getting to the point that we can help teachers to have that co-curricular resource or the beautiful museum that we have here. VOC has some great resources for students, for teachers. Our witness videos, our curriculum and things, the physical plant that we have right here in Washington, D.C. that should be full of students and families every day of the week. We are poised as a fairly young organization when it comes to these resources to be of great use. And we need it now more than ever. Our history textbooks these days have largely lost a sense of the scale of the destructive power of communism in the 20th century. And you can't really understand why decisions were made during World War II, or why decisions were made in the 1980s, or the legacy decisions that are made in the late 90s and early 2000s, unless you understand the structure of international relations from the 20th century and the decisions that had to be made as global communist revolutionaries were causing insurrection and revolution literally on every continent.
Picking up on that point, I've spoken with lots of student groups in my role since I've been here at VOC, and one of the disappointing things was how many high school seniors. I would ask a group to say, who knows who Joseph Stalin was? Just at a simple level. To your point about the history books don't cover this information, barely 20% would even know who he was. Then when I would follow up with an individual student saying, okay, who was Joseph Stalin? The only answer I would get was a U.S. ally during World War II, the head of the Soviet Union or Russia. No mention of mass murder of 20 plus million. No mention of the repression under his regime. So I found that to be both depressing from how bad we've done as a country in educating, but also kind of hopeful that if the level of ignorance for some of the young people is so low that just providing them very basic historical information about the worst communist dictators of the 20th century, Stalin, Mao Zedong, quickly helps orient them into understanding, well, no, that's against every impulse and value that I have. So I don't know. Have you had experiences talking with young people about this? I mean, you already referenced that our history books don't cover it, and that's why the VOC resources I think can be so helpful. But have you had interactions like this, or what's your view of how do we actually reach these young people and convince them?
Yeah, I've had some of these same experiences that you're talking about, and one of the areas that's really challenging is that the great crimes of the 20th century often happen in communist countries. And so we can point to the Holocaust as a type of totalitarian event. And it's the natural completion of unfettered power by one people group over another, justified by an ideology. It's an important case. But there were other mass murders the Cultural Revolution in China, the so-called Holodomor, which is the forced starvation of millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s as their grain was shipped away from them. That happened at the hands of the communists. They happened at the hands of someone like Mao. They happened at the hands of someone like Joseph Stalin. And those are the incredible shaping points in history that are often missed with these groups. And one of the reasons that they're missed is a loss of a sense of what America was doing and what it was standing for in the 20th century. That America was a force for good, that it came to the aid of Europe during the First World War, it came to the aid of Europe during the Second World War, but there was this other thing going on. After World War II, we call it the Cold War. And a reorientation for our history in the United States needs to be about the positive role that the United States played with the Marshall Plan and other things to help rebuild Europe, to provide humanitarian aid all across the world through the U.S. Agency for International Development. We were the lead on human rights laws, 1972 Helsinki, Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Carter was good on human rights. Reagan was. The U.S. led. It's a story of good. That would be a big reorientation for us.
Absolutely. You mentioned the Holodomor, and here at the VOC Museum, we just closed our recent temporary exhibit on the Holodomor, which was great to host here at the museum. It's something that unfortunately many Americans don't know about, and great to have student groups and many visitors come see and learn about the Holodomor, particularly as it relates to Russia's invasion of Ukraine today. You can't understand the context of the of Russia's war in Ukraine today without understanding that critical history. But you've been here now. You've been taking up the leadership role. Tell our audience a little bit about your impressions of the museum. The museum is very new here, just opened less than 2 years ago. Why don't you give your own impression of the VOC Museum?
Yeah, at that opening of the museum in the summer of 2022, I was an audience member and actually wrote an op-ed afterwards. You've got to come see this museum. It's amazing. It's a little gem right here in Washington. And it's really in two ways. The first way is that there are 50 paintings by a survivor of the Gulag that are incredibly moving. Kind of a semi-expressionistic set of paintings. This guy survived the Gulag. He was a trained artist and architect, Nicholas Getman, and then he hid the paintings as he painted them in his barn in the years after he got out of the Gulag. And they tell a story that's a story of deep deprivation and tyranny, and also glimmers of hope. And second, there is it's a small museum. It's a very accessible museum that tells the story, frankly, of the lies of communism and the bitter human toll that it took. It's an age-appropriate museum. In other words, it's perfectly appropriate for upper grade children from elementary school, for middle school, for high school students, and it's something that's accessible in a town where some of the museums are so massive you don't know what you can do. Here's a place where you'd have an experience that would be, say, a 1-hour experience with your family, with your school group, but really get a sense of a powerful movement in history. But it's a movement that ended in failure in the Warsaw Pact and things. And why? And it's because with help from the West, the people on the ground sought their natural impulse of freedom.
Yeah, at the very end of our permanent gallery, we have the panel that talks about 1989 as both the year of miracles and tears. That we saw the miracle of the fall of the Soviet Union, its collapse between 1989 and 1991, but also that was the year that the Tiananmen Square massacre took place. So both the victory of the U.S. against communism, ending the official kind of Cold War, but also the fact that it is a project that is unfinished, and unfortunately we're seeing the dangers of that rise today. I'll just add my own one little tidbit of one of the aspects I found most interesting in our museum, particularly as students have engaged with it, have been the interactive exhibits, where much of the museum deals with the important history, talks about the brutality, whether individuals, victims who've been executed or to the gulags. We wanted to make sure that visitors saw that what was life like for a more average citizen. Thankfully, I always say most citizens were not executed or went to the gulags, but every citizen living under a communist regime felt the oppression one way or the other. So it's really great to see students students play these interactive electronic games where they have kind of a character and they see what are the choices people have to make living under communism. And when I'm sometimes giving a tour, I let folks know, unfortunately, there are no good choices in this story. But then what we see at the end, of course, is at the end of these stories, the visitor realizes and is shown this was actually a real person. And they actually see the Witness Project teaser for one of these real individuals VOC has interviewed and are part of our powerful Witness Project documentary series. So it's been great to see young people engage with that. Let me come back to your time growing up. Tell me about your experience hearing about the fall of the Berlin Wall. You mentioned you're a senior in high school at the time, I think. What was that like? How did that impact your life and your way of viewing things at the time?
Yeah, I had been to Europe once in high school, Western Europe, hadn't gone behind the Iron Curtain or anything of that nature, and then went again a few years later after the fall in 1989. I will say that year, 1989, to see the wall come down and to see the joy on television of these people who had been, and then kind of the domino effect over the next couple of years while I was a college student was remarkable. And one of the things that was remarkable about it was just a couple of years later, I did make it as far east as Prague. So I've been to Germany, to Bonn, and then a few years later, Prague and Vienna. And particularly in Prague then, you still had really still an oppressive sense in the early 90s that anything could happen. You looked at the old Soviet architecture. You saw how quiet people were as you're around town. Kind of the lack of confidence, a lack of you're at a restaurant or something. Servers don't really talk to you. It's not the kind of customer service you see in the West where there's a confidence in the person engaging you. And just that sense of wariness that you just talked about individual people there. And at the same time, 1991, Iraq gobbles its neighbor Kuwait in 1990, and the US leads a coalition, not of conquest, but to liberate another member of the United Nations. And then once they're liberated, we don't impose our rules or anything on them. What a juxtaposition at that crucial point of 1990. The U.S. didn't take advantage of Eastern Europe. The U.S. didn't take advantage of Iraq and Kuwait. It led a coalition to liberate a country, just like it had done in Grenada a few years before. But it did it in trying to reestablish a global order that protected individual governments and societies. So that was a very formative period for me about two different models: a liberty-loving, respectful of law and human rights model in the West, and these other types of models in other places.
So picking up on those models, and we already touched on this, but it feels as though many young people today really doubt our Western model and have an affinity for the ideologies of socialism or communism. Now, I mentioned, I feel that's somewhat tenuous because they're so ignorant of the real horrors of communism, and that's, I think, a lot of our mission to help educate them. But what do you see as the real kind of challenge in terms of trying to reaching them so that they don't fall prey to the dangerous ideology of socialism or communism and find a new love for our Western, system, as you described, that, a liberty-focused order?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a fundamental distinction in the way that we're teaching American history, that up until some moment, I don't know when it was, 2000, 2005, 2010, we used to teach the great story of Western civilization, lots of flaws, but progress towards the fundamental sense of human dignity and human rights, of human freedom, and the bundle of liberties that goes with that: conscience, private property, freedom of religion, and what that means. Martin Luther King Jr. bought into that. Harry S. Truman bought into that. John F. Kennedy bought into that. A common good approach of liberty for everybody. We made mistakes in American history, but we have had a steady progress of overcoming them because of the values of the Declaration of Independence aspirationally are for everybody. The change 15 years ago or something is throughout higher ed and then in high schools and elsewhere, we started to teach a different story. And that story is that human history is always the story of oppressor and oppressed. It never gets better. The levers of power are hidden, and it's usually white men taking from everybody else. And by the way, that is exactly the story of the Communist Manifesto. says there's no such thing as religion. It's an opiate for the masses. It's not a real thing. The driving faith that inspires so many people like Mother Teresa to do good. No. It's an opiate to keep the masses down. So this new lens, you want to call it critical theory or whatever, it's a neo-Marxist lens. And our young people, many places have been taught that's the story of history. Well, of course it's a lie, but we have some work to do to recover the educational systems and programs that point to the American way, the better way. And I don't mean American chauvinistically. I mean, America realized something that was largely true for everybody about we can make progress as we respect the dignity of others and we limit government power.
Right. Well, this year, as you know, VOC celebrates our 30th anniversary since we were chartered by Congress. You've now taken over as our new president and CEO. Tell us a little bit about your vision for VOC. What's VOC's future look like?
Yeah, well, I see an exciting future for VOC. One is to become a better known and used resource right here in Washington, D.C., whether it's providing educational resources on policy, about how to be thinking about the communist regimes that are out there and how to counter them, or our student programs, opening this museum more. But over time, I think that there's something you and I have talked about, is a much larger digital and virtual presence for people to have a better understanding through virtual reality of what it would have been like to go to a gulag. What would it have been like to be under communist oppression? What would it be like to see the Berlin Wall fall in 1989? What is it like to have to be in a place like Cuba or Nicaragua? And then over time, as more and more people bring to us artifacts that for display, over time, a larger physical plant that will allow people to have a greater experience right here in Washington, D.C. I think we have a rosy future, but there's a lot of hard work ahead, particularly as we're committed not just to education, but to providing the intellectual resources so that policymakers can counter the evils of communism today.
Well, you're exactly right, and I know I speak for myself and the whole VOC team that there is a lot of work ahead, and we're so looking forward to your leadership helping move VOC forward into our next 30 years. So as we close, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
You know, one of the things that just really inspired me, and it's a common trope that Ronald Reagan said, they lose, we win. And he didn't say that publicly, and I think the reason is because he didn't want to be taken out of context, that what he meant was, they lose, the communist apparatchiks, the leadership, the ideology loses. But the we win is all the citizens, not just in the United States, who don't have to worry about nuclear war with the Soviet Union anymore, but all the Russians who don't have to live the life of lies, all the Cubans who don't have to live, they win. The we is a universal we. And so the thing that's exciting to me is this kind of that notion that there's still unfinished business, both in American education, but in places like China, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Laos, et cetera, there's unfinished business. But I think we're better poised to win on behalf of those people today than we were 30 years ago.
Great. Well, thank you for joining me today.
Andrew, thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here.